let me start with John, perhaps. I want to start with the economy, and then we will come back to some of the other issues. I'm interested in your reactions, John, first and foremost, to some of George's propositions about we've had these 4 anchoring principles, and now there's this 5th lever of immigration policy, and what that all adds up to you in terms of Australia's sort of medium and long-term economic outlook. I know that George has talked in the past about the risks of a property bubble leading to a bust. Do you share that concern that we might be heading to a precipice?
I think one is always very brave to speculate about the future prices of any financial asset or in any asset, including house prices. One can observe, and I think it's a very good piece from Westpac out a couple of days ago, showing that there is a very, very big increase in the level of apartment building, and that because of the way the apartment market works or development market works, a lot of that's now baked in for another 2 years worth of building. So it's going to be a very interesting time over the next few years. In terms of the economy more generally, and of course that's not about the prices of assets, which go up and down and from time to time, but you know, of course what impacts our lives is economic growth, and particularly not just GDP but gross national income, how much of that actually accrues to Australians. And the short answer, of course, is we've had a fantastic, 66 years more or less, a bit more than that, 70 years since the end of World War II. You know, that's the overwhelming story, is it's been pretty good. And indeed, Australia was quite a long way behind much of the developed world in about 1945, and a lot of that we have caught up. And you can see that in Australian living standards. They're very high by global standards. The catch, of course, is that the developed world has slowed down. And indeed, the rate of economic growth in the developed world was slowing down well before the financial crisis. And in many ways, what we are seeing today is really just the long-run trend line, with the sort of financial crisis as a kind of downward blip, but the long-run trend line carrying on downwards. And I think that penny has finally started to drop in the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank have all started issuing reports with titles like Slower for Longer. And I think that we have yet to absorb what are all of the flow-on consequences of economic growth, which is not disastrous. It's not saying that living standards will go backwards. It's not saying that economic growth will stop. But it is saying that economic growth may well be a lot slower than we have become accustomed to. That's certainly what has been happening in the developed world, rest of the developed world. It is Australia's experience for the last 4 or 5 years, in effect. And there are plenty of reasons to think that that's the most likely outcome. And there's not that much that Australian governments can do about it. Australian governments can ensure that we get pretty close to the efficient frontier for the developed world. But there's manifestly very little they can do about the growth rate for the developed world as a whole. And I suspect it is extremely difficult for us to get a long way in front of that, if you like, efficient frontier. And we are now quite close to it.
Okay. Just want to bring it back to Australia, sort of here and now. And Marcia, I wanted to start with you, because often when we think in terms of Indigenous affairs, we start with a bit of a deficit mindset, and we go immediately to the social problems that are plaguing Indigenous communities. And I don't want to put them to one side at all, but I just want to sort of balance out the argument and think in terms of the economic future of our Indigenous people and the way in which the ability of Indigenous communities to be able to negotiate deals with mining companies to develop their country. What's your perspective on the future for our Indigenous communities within this broader sort of Australian economic development story?
Well, that's the right question to ask. And I'm not at all insulted that you want to put the disadvantage statistics to one side, because I think what we most of all need in the national debate is a different narrative about Indigenous people. So let me divide the country up into the zones that I see. So some years ago in Canberra, a bureaucrat was overheard to say, what we're dealing with is a black North and a white South. And that attitude, that was especially in the Howard period, that attitude shaped Indigenous affairs policy. And it caused a huge amount of resentment amongst Indigenous people who didn't live in the North, and resulted in policy skewing that we're all still living with today. The tide's turned. There are some better policies, but there is still an absence of a policy framework for Indigenous Australia. There is no policy framework. It's a bit like a gambling den. Somebody picks an 8, somebody puts their chips on 22. It's very random and inconsistent. So we have now the development of North Australia, the white paper, the North Australian development approach. That's very significant. Now, most Australians who live in the south, and particularly the southeast, think, there must be 1%, 2% or 3% of Indigenous Australians in our population. They don't think about the regional variation. In North Australia, well, let's just start with the Northern Territory. About 30% of the population is Indigenous. It's been the case for series of governments now that, up to 5 of the ministers, including the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, has been Aboriginal. Out of, I can't remember the total number of seats, 28, I think. And so consistently across the North, the average is, say, 16% Indigenous in the population. So there is a majority Indigenous population in the North, extending into the deserts, and of course it varies again enormously depending on where the towns are, because the towns are white, the hinterland's black. Although increasingly there are black towns because the whites have left. Then so you have white flight out of rural and remote Australia, especially with the end of the mining boom. And then in the south, what was 2 or 3% of the population being Indigenous is increasingly being swamped by the population trends that you've been talking about, George. And Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders are not keeping up with the debate. And so you'll notice that most Indigenous leaders address themselves to old white Australia and have nothing whatsoever to say to multicultural Australia. And I think that is the worst strategic mistake that our Indigenous leaders can make. I'm often referred to in the media as an Indigenous leader because they don't seem to know enough words in the English language to describe me. I'm really, as somebody said here, a public intellectual. I'm not a leader of anything. And I actually don't have much influence over the Indigenous leadership. Most of the Indigenous leadership are quite resistant to the kind of economic analysis and demographic analysis that you've provided. They would prefer to ignore it and insert a kind of Indigenous exceptionalism argument into the national debate. That's what I think is the strategic mistake. If Indigenous people have a hope of surviving economically, socially and culturally, then we must engage with these big demographic trends, but also lose the north-south split. So I'm very concerned about where Indigenous people fit in economically. I had a lot to say during the mining boom. I raised the resource curse. I raised the end of the mining boom as a policy issue. I was comprehensively ignored by all sides. Now, however, there is another split in the Indigenous population, and that is, as you say, the people who've benefited from the Indigenous land use agreements, particularly in Western Australia, and a little in the Northern Territory and somewhat in Queensland, where, through good luck or good advice, they had excellent lawyers, negotiated very robust agreements with payment flows that will see them through for another 60 years. Not taking advantage of good financial advice, however, so they'll lose a lot of that value by not reinvesting in the economy, by not engaging economically. So that's a very small part of our population who've done well out of the mining boom. The mining boom did kickstart very good training and jobs policies. I will say that. That was probably the best thing to come out of the mining boom for Indigenous Australians. The rest of the Indigenous population that, didn't benefit from the mining boom or not engaged in the mining boom, even downstream, have been set back even further economically. And so there are these growing disparities or actually, a growing polarisation of the levels of disparity. And now we can almost say that just less than 50% of our population have a chance of parity in their own lifetimes, like me, and just over 50% of the Indigenous population have little or no chance of reaching parity in their lifetimes. So what could unite the Indigenous population and provide a national policy framework? It is economic participation. So it's all of those factors that go to bringing everyone up to parity through economic participation. Jobs, training, business development, procurement policies, and particularly education. So for the public servants in the room, I would say if you have any influence over procurement policies, that is the most successful policy lever of the last decade. The Federal Indigenous Procurement Policy, which came from the Forest Review report, which I worked on, changed the government spend from about 6 million to 156 million in under a year, surprised everybody. The bureaucrats ratcheted back the targets, and they blew the targets out of the water in under a year.
Number of Indigenous businesses.
The Indigenous businesses, as soon as the procurement policy was improved with the Forest Review recommendations, the Indigenous businesses took advantages of it and went from 6 to 156 million. We now need to get, up to parity, which is 3 billion, or 3% of, say, 20 billion of the government spend, leaving out the submarines and so on. And that's what will enable us to reach parity.
Right. Okay. I think George wants to come in on this point, and I want to bring Penny in as well. This idea of inclusion in the economy, particularly given the sort of the new normal of relatively low growth, and the point you were making, George,
Marcia,
that new jobs are going to them.
Yeah, Marcia, this is the question. When and you have been thinking about this a lot. When you consider what the political risk is for lower middle income Australians losing touch with this new Australia, this 21st century Australia, do you see a unifying conversation that includes both the Indigenous story and the everybody else keeping up story to be the same story, or do you think that there's going to be a wedge between those two constituencies and that politics just zeroes in on that part of Anglo-Australia that is going to be left behind, and in fact finds a new cause and forgets the original issue?
Well, yes. That's a very
Sorry to colour code it, but I think we have to think of it this way. Yeah.
Look, no, completely. Noel Pearson ran the argument for his view of his proposal for constitutional recognition under the banner "Completing the Commonwealth." And so his view is that and rightly so, the Constitution is our British heritage. If we recognise Indigenous Australians, that's the 70,000-year Indigenous heritage of the country being recognised. And then the third plank is multicultural Australia, where I do agree with people who say that we're the most successful multicultural nation on earth. There's no question in my mind, and I've travelled the world. That's the third plank. If our Constitution recognised that makeup in some way, even if it's not in the Constitution itself, but in extra constitutional arrangements, rather than as we have at the moment, as you rightly said, the white political master, we would have a national narrative. And I think that is our national narrative, our cultural narrative. 70,000 years of Indigenous history, democracy the Westminster tradition, stable democracy, is the British element, and then multicultural Australia is the innovation and diversity, both of which give us resilience on the national stage, resilience and strength on the national stage. It's what makes us attractive to the world.
Yep. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these points more in question, but I just want to return to the issue of economic inclusion more generally. As I said, George had that quite startling statistic about the new jobs are all being taken up by our newer migrants to Australia. Penny, what are your thoughts on where the new jobs are coming from? What are the challenges that it poses for different cohorts within Australia?
I guess there's so many issues that George raised that we could be talking about, but the one that is most on my mind is probably influenced by the fact that I'm currently doing, along with a colleague, Professor Jim Ogloff, who's one of our most eminent forensic psychologists in Australia, based in Victoria, and he and I are doing a review of youth justice services. And when you were talking, I just keep going back to the fact that currently around Australia, we've got a focus on youth crime and youth disengagement, and many, many jurisdictions. So when you think about just recently, New South Wales has released their crime statistics for young offenders. We've got a blitz going on in Queensland, in Townsville, around youth crime as we speak, a few weeks operation. We've got a Royal Commission in the Northern Territory. We've got the sort of review I'm talking about at every jurisdiction on a very regular basis, is saying, what are we doing about this new phenomena around youth crime? Not new, has been an issue for a long time, but is very much the focus of public attention and concern, I think, in many jurisdictions now. And so when I've been thinking about that issue, I've been trying to position it in terms of a broader context. We don't want to just think about those young people who are engaging with the criminal justice system, but thinking about what's happening in young Australians' life experiences and what does it mean for us as public policy people and advisors to government about the way in which they should be responding to this. And I came across a really interesting study that was done by the Health Promotion Foundation and the CSIRO about looking forward and saying, what are the big things that are going to impact on the health and well-being of young people into the future in Australia and in Victoria in that case. And they identified 5 things that have enormous resonance for me in the context of what George was saying. The first one was about the rising bar about participating in the economy. And they made the point about how challenging it's going to be in the future for young people to gain employment and embark upon the sort of careers that we've all had the opportunity to enjoy, because the skills and educational levels, the rising expectation about who will be capable of entering into the job market, and no longer is that just in Australia. And this was really poignantly brought home to me, where these young people are going to be competing because of the capacity to work remotely, not just with their fellow young people around Australia, but around the world to get employment in Australia. And it's borne home to me when I think about even my day-to-day work. We link in with our company in India regularly to get work done. And India, not because it's cheaper, they have highly skilled workforce able to do things for us in a 24-hour cycle that we couldn't necessarily access in Australia. And coming down to Adelaide yesterday on the plane, I had the irony of sitting next to 2 young builders, and they were talking to me about how even in the building industry is no longer something that you would think is domestic. They are offshoring their drafting to Vietnam because of the precision of the skills of the people they can access there, and again, the speed of turnover. They might wait for drafting for a month here in Australia and they can get it in 24 hours if they source it out of Vietnam to a high quality. So that's the first thing. The next point that this research talked about was global reach, just the fact that people will be working where there's no fixed abode. You don't have an office of the future in the way that we've all grown up through our careers, and where you will have people who will have to have a portfolio type of work. They might not have one employer, might be selling their skills and knowledge to a variety of employers into the future. Life's richer tapestry is what they describe the cultural mix and the impact in terms of our dynamic inclusive cultural society where there's very real positives from that, but really also some significant challenges. And you just have to think about the fact that we still have significant overrepresentation in things like our criminal justice system for Indigenous people, Maori and Pacific Islanders, and newly arrived refugee communities. And you herald a little bit of the point, George, you were making about that cultural diversity benefiting all. And for some, it's incredibly challenging because of residual racism and feelings of disaffection and disengagement that we're seeing playing out in some of those young communities now. The next issue they identified was overexposure online, and this is just something where the benefits that accrue around being able to have online access and be able to do jobs differently, but also what it means for maturation and social experience for young people. And this was something really borne home to me when you think about adolescent health and development. Typically they talk about, and all of the international literature talks about, the emerging maturity of a young person and that gradual transition from the influence of family during adolescence to the influence of peers. And all the studies that have done that show young people can make as sensible decisions as other adults when they are on their own, but collectively with their peer group is where some of their decision-making processes can be distorted. And the Internet of Things, bringing in that division between home, family, peer, and the challenges that means for the way in which we grapple with that. And finally, their report, as you would expect, might focus on mental health and what are all of the implications of taking mental health out of the shadows, but still dealing with adolescent mental health issues in that context. So for me, I guess my recent focus on this issue has made me think we need to really take a very big and serious look at this, because we think we might have a problem of youth crime today, but if that forecast of what the CSIRO said and the Health Promotion Foundation says about young people's challenges into the future is real, and I think most of us would think it probably is, we will need to have, as public policy people, a very strong and hard look at that to think about what advice we're going to give to governments as to how they might address this and deal with a more inclusive engagement of young people in our economy going forward.
John, on Penny's point about youth and jobs, we know that labour markets are local rather than national in practice. What's your perspective on how the economic development story is going to play out in different regions?
Yeah.
Are they the same three groupings that George has talked about?
Yeah, look, I think one of the most obvious trends we have, not only in Australia but around the world, is that the locus of economic activity is focusing towards cities, towards big cities, and towards the centre of big cities. So although you might think that the implication of better information technology would be more an increase in remote working, you would be wrong. So if you look at the history of communications technology over the last 250 years, as we've gone from the post office to the telegraph to the telephone to the telex to the fax to internet, the impact of every single one of those technologies has been to concentrate where people physically work in cities and towards the centre of big cities. And indeed, if you look at between 2006 2011, over half of the jobs created in our 5 largest cities were created in the CBD and the 10 kilometres around it. We will find out from the 2016 census whether that's continued, but my guess, looking around Melbourne and Sydney, is that has almost certainly, if anything, accelerated. And of course, the firms that were the first to say, no, you can't work remotely, ironically, were technology firms. They were the first firms to say, no, actually, being here in person makes a real difference. So my guess is, in fact, we will continue to see that, and indeed we're seeing that reflected in regional economies as they see a significant drain of the younger population out of the regions, essentially because there aren't a lot of jobs being created there and moving to ex-mining and moving towards cities. So I think that's one of the things that's going on. But then, of course, the other thing that we're seeing going on in these cities is a lot of opportunity towards the centre and relatively little opportunity towards the edge. And the reality is, given our transport networks and just given the sheer size of our cities, it is very difficult to get from the edge of our cities in towards the centre where most of those jobs are being created. And indeed, we can see that, in fact, very few people make those commutes. People who live on the edges tend to go around the sides or maybe in one or two suburbs, but very few of them, in fact, try and commute all the way to the centre. And the implication of that for young people is those who wind up with accommodation in the middle and inner rings of our cities, by and large, not doing too badly. Those who wind up towards the edge, much higher rates of not being in employment, education and training, all of the other kind of social indicators that give us cause for concern. And of course, we are accelerating that trend because of what's happening in the home ownership market and the home and the house price market. When you make it very difficult to subdivide the middle rings of your suburbs, what that means is that those who've already bought houses, which by definition means people over the age of 35 pretty much, do fine, but the younger generation just can't afford to buy there and is increasingly struggling to rent there. And so what happens is that you shut that younger generation out, certainly the bottom half in terms of income earners, out of living in the places where there are substantial opportunities, and you create this real divide in our cities between the middle and the centre, the centre and those kind of middle rings and the edges. And I think that's one of the really big challenges, especially for youth policy. That said, one thing I just wanted to pick up on is we always hear this stuff about, the youth is going to custard and all the rest of it. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things is you look at the actual numbers and any way you cut it, younger generations, are essentially drinking less alcohol and getting themselves in less trouble and winding up pregnant at teenage years less often, and, all of those kind of social indicators are, if anything, heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I think we've got to be
Except
careful
for
about being
excluded.
complacent, because it's the people who are achieving having many of those good things. I think the point I was trying to focus on a little bit is, what does this mean for those who have less opportunities, who might more likely to be not able to capitalise on the benefit, and what are we doing from a social policy point of view and a very deliberate consideration of that, trying to make sure that we're not leaving behind a very significant proportion of young people.
Yeah. I agree with that, but my point is we've always left behind a significant
Yeah.
portion, and my point is we are in fact leaving behind a smaller portion. I don't want to suggest for a moment that leaving anyone behind is acceptable, and I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't be worrying about that. I just wanted to put it in that context.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, though, that what we are seeing is those ones who are being left behind are getting more entrenched in that cycle of disadvantage. In my circumstances, talking about that link to the criminal justice system, you are seeing it becoming harder and harder to break the cycle of reoffending.
And the people we're talking about, Penny, who are being left behind are typically in sole parent households.
It varies, but yeah, the data is now, we're getting good data for the first time because we're linking data across the system. So data linkage is helping tell a better picture.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is as much by observation as anything, because I addressed a conference of judges of all groups just a couple of weeks ago, Supreme Court judge conference in Canberra, and one of the senior judges came up to me afterwards. He says, if you ever get back on the Insiders program, I want you to reframe the crisis accommodation and the housing debate away from, not that you want people not to concentrate on people sleeping rough, but the bigger issue is basically security of tenure for sole parents, because most of the people that come through his doors, he was telling me, were kids that grow up in sole parent households, and there's domestic violence there to worry about, and these kids not only don't have a role model for an employed parent, but they have another parent who's belting the hell out of the mother, and they're on the run most of the time. And I thought it was just a simple way that somebody can reframe an observation for you.
Yeah.
All our CEOs will sleep out one time a year, and this is the way they're going to deal with a homeless crisis. But the bigger homeless crisis is basically loss of connection to security of tenure, whether it's rental, crisis accommodation, refuge, or whatever. If you're on the run from abode to abode because the ex is coming after you, you're looking at 2-3 generations worth of social.
Absolutely.
problem.
And I think that the better we start using this data, sadly, the story is quite challenging.
Yes.
So the more you look at it, you say, wow, if you look at the trajectory of a percentage of young people who are engaged in the public service system in terms of the out-of-home care, child protection system and their trajectory into the youth offending stream and ultimately to adult offending, increasingly the data is telling us if they are removed from their family, spend time in out-of-home care, particularly in residential care, increasingly concerns about the outcomes that there are. If you take the example of the link with family violence, those broader issues of disadvantage, it is harder to ameliorate the harm of abuse and neglect. And I guess throughout my career, I probably always knew that, because when I left child protection and out-of-home care and families and went into the justice system and corrections, I'd walk around prisons and I'd see people who were my clients of the past and go, wow, what's happening in this system? But data is telling us more, giving us much more information that makes me worry about the sort of trends that Vic Health study revealed, because it's just quite challenging to us to say, are some of our programs achieving the results we want?
So that brings us back to the challenge for governments in being able to use the data, but also to think long term. And Marcia, you talked about the kind of the lack of a sufficient framework at the moment going forward, and George talked about the political volatility that kind of mitigates against that longer term planning. What's your thoughts on how we deal with that?
Okay, so with the Indigenous population, and this must be the case with some incoming migrant populations as well. I think it's 60% of our population is under the age of 25.
Yeah.
And I noticed that the Horn of Africa population in Melbourne is very, very young. It must be something similar. What happens with an ethnic population which is majority youthful or young is that they're targeted by criminal networks. I'm astonished that an incredibly well done report, very well researched report by the Australian Crime Commission, Intelligence Task Force on Violence in Indigenous Communities, has been absolutely buried. Not a single politician in any of the jurisdictions has raised the content of this report publicly. It has been absolutely buried. And what does it find? That violence in the Indigenous community is off the charts. And this question of violence against women and children is the critical policy factor for, human services, social security, offices of, women's policy and so on. And with housing, and, the plight of the single mother household, let's stop saying single parent, it's single mother household. The social housing policies have to change. And so I'm seeing a bit of movement. So, for instance, a couple of jurisdictions are New South Wales has it. I hope the Northern Territory gets it quickly. A domestic violence offender register, and then secure housing for victims of violence, secure social housing, so that the woman and her children do not have to leave. If you fix those two problems, you will see change pretty quickly, I think, because the insecurity of a mother and children is what's driving youth crime. Once a mother loses control of her kids because she's been driven out of her home by violence, then the kids end up being picked up by the cops, and then they're in youth detention. Then they're removed from the care of the mother pretty much permanently. Even in Victoria, the rate of removal of Aboriginal children is 1 in 4. And it's driven by, really, if you get to the policy basis, it's driven by stupid social housing policies. I see it's changing, and I acknowledge that. But, this is the big discussion we had in the Forest Review. What is it with social housing? Why is this so wrong? Well, it's very simple. People who are never going to really join the economy, people who are going to remain welfare dependent, are given priority in social housing. And they pretty much get social housing, rent subsidised housing for life. If you want to go and get a job, if you're out looking for a job or if you have a job, you will be excluded from social housing by the means testing. It's the wrong way round. you have to encourage people to join the economy by giving them security of tenure for some period of time. It doesn't have to be permanent, so that they can then move on into other housing. So the victims of violence and the people who are looking for jobs are doomed to, entrenchment in poverty by these policies. So I just wanted to push for better policies on violence. And
just as an observation, that is what you're talking about is probably the most extreme effective marginal tax rate that exists in the system. You lose your house if you get a job. It doesn't work, right? It makes absolutely no economic sense.
Well, the mining companies in Western Australia pleaded with the WA government to renew a moratorium. They got one moratorium on Homes West, evicting people from social housing once they started to earn, I think it was, I can't remember the cut-off point, it was like $35,000 or $45,000, which actually coincides with a training wage. As soon as, and it's any individual in a household earning that money gets the entire household evicted. So they couldn't get the moratorium on that policy, and so their workers would come to work after couch surfing, tired, and pose a threat to safety at work. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
Okay, look, this has been a fascinating conversation. We've touched on a whole range of policy areas, but want to leave plenty of time for people to ask their questions. I think there's a couple of roving microphones. So I'm just going to see if you'd like to put up your hand, indicate if you'd like to ask a question of someone on the panel. If you could let us know where you're from. Here, there's one down here, please, if we could bring the microphone. If you just let us know who you are and who you'd like to direct your question to. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Helen Walker from Department of Health. In fact, from Sala, so I'm out in the coalface. But I'm really interested in the whole notion of federation and constitution reform, etc. And I'm also very interested, having come back from Victoria to Adelaide in the last 12 months and seen the cultural difference and the sense of effort to get the state going again, etc. So I'm interested in that. But just picking up on George's comments about the disparateness of the emerging disparateness, if you like, of the Australian landscape. And it seems to me that one of the most pressing things as a community we need to be doing is looking at federation again and what sort of Australia do we want. And I know that that's a hackneyed phrase, but I think you've painted a really clear picture that, it's all very well for Sydney and Melbourne to be growing. But, Australia exists beyond the Great Dividing Range, and I think that we need to share some of the growth and opportunity.
Thanks. So can I just check, are you asking about whether we need to redraw the boundaries in the federation, or is it a broader question about federalism?
It's a broader question about federalism and understanding more, I think, what George is talking about. What are the aspirations of people in this country, and is there a way of, I guess, sharing or being more generous with each other about growth and development, and therefore the sort of social fabric that we work with?
Do you want to go?
Yeah. Look, it's a common dream in Australia that governments will be able to distribute where economic growth happens. If wishes were fishes, the sea would be full. We have 116 years of abject failure of regional economic development policy. And my guess is that ain't going to change until we stop trying. And the reason for that is that what drives a firm to set up a economic activity in a particular location is all of the economic things that lie around that. By and large, not driven by government, although government can get things like the education system right and the infrastructure right, but assuming that those things are moderately okay, and I would observe certainly of of the large capitals and indeed even the large towns in Australia, those fundamentals are usually pretty okay. What then drives the decision is, where do my customers live? Where do my suppliers live? Where do the other firms that one way or another I network live? Where do my potential workers live? Although that one less so, because they tend to follow wherever the firms go. And so it is not as though the Melbourne and Sydney have grown, and the centres of Melbourne and Sydney have grown because of government policy. Indeed, if you look at all of the official planning documents of every state government in Australia for the last 20 years have basically said, we are trying to grow much faster in the regions, and then if it's going to be growing in the large capitals, growing at the edge of the capitals. What happened? We grew the centre. Why did that happen? Because firms made choices to do that, because that's what the economic drivers led them to do, because they could basically make more money if they set up towards the centre rather than elsewhere. Now, you can pump economic water uphill. You can basically create such large incentives for firms that they will set up towards the edges of either cities or in Adelaide rather than Melbourne. But pumping economic water uphill is really expensive. And the minute that you look away, economic water will immediately start flowing downhill again. I think, and it's interesting, it's worth being clear about where this is an issue and is not. Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and the Brisbane conurbation, which is more than just Brisbane, clearly growing quite quickly. Perth growing quite quickly, it'll go up and down with a mining boom, but there it is. I think there is a particular and very difficult issue for Adelaide. And Adelaide's problem is it's too close to Melbourne. And so what we are seeing is quite significant economic activity essentially shifting from Adelaide to Melbourne, particularly at the high-end services firms, which is, to be blunt, where an awful lot of the money is. And I don't have a solution for that other than perhaps to, essentially ban commercial air services between Adelaide and Melbourne. I'm guessing that may not be wildly popular. So I don't think that you can ask governments to shift that, because governments have never been able to dictate the locus of economic activity. All they have ever been able to do is ensure that the basic infrastructure is okay, obviously in terms of transport and utilities and education, all that kind of stuff, and in terms of then making sure that we get the social welfare piece right. But the social welfare piece is merely distributing whatever pie there is. It's not actually growing the pie somewhere different.
Do you want to come in on that, George?
Yeah, I'm going to try and add a thought to that. I accept the framework, but I have a difficulty at the moment with the letting the market decide where people live story. And I'll give you an active example of why. If you don't have an active state, and I don't mean which tier of government, I mean the idea of government making active decisions based on where they think people will go, and if they don't like where they're going, they might need to think about diverting them somewhere else. I think this is something, especially as you move from 24 to 40 million, you have to think about. We haven't talked about the environment at all at the moment, but you need to ask that question. So the story of the last, since the 70s, but the big story in the last 20 years in terms of internal migration has been the refugee from the Sydney property market going to the southeast corner of Queensland. That is the single biggest internal flow in Australia. And a market-based system would say this is a rational choice made by people who don't want to be living on the fringes of Sydney and will go to Brisbane. And in Queensland, of course, the demographers will tell you every time there's a differential of about 15 or 20% between the median house price in Sydney and the median house price in Brisbane, they know people are going to come. They know that. And this is not the Joe Bjelke-Petersen death duty price signal of the 70s. This is just an active choice to move from one city to another. Now, however many governments in New South Wales, Victoria with the federal overlay have been looking at this story for the last 20 years, you know that the decisions they've made have been terrible. There hasn't been any effort to improve Brisbane's carrying capacity or the southeast corner's carrying capacity. The next big story is what happens to the next million people who want to go to Sydney and find out that they can't live in Sydney. Most of the population growth that the New South Wales government's operating on within the state, half the population growth is in the Western Sydney corridor in the next 20 years. That's their planning. If governments don't actually think about diverting some of those population flows and think actively about how to do it, you will get a multiple of the southeast corner of Queensland scenario. And we know a lot of the political volatility starts there. It's not Western Sydney, it's actually that southeast corner of Queensland. And you know, by the time you get to, you know, beyond the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, you're in the Hanson Belt. So we're looking at things that are observable in the last 10 or 15 years that tell you need to think a little more than just letting growth rule dictate where people live. Now, that may just mean that governments need to get ahead of the curve. And when you say infrastructure, I think it means a lot more than just say, oh, flick the switch to infrastructure. It needs something much more substantial. It actually needs to get into the sitting planning space, which, you know, a free market person like I've been for a long time would say, oh, you don't want to do that. No, I think you need to think about it. And you maybe need to think about how you tweak your public and private. I mean, I'm not saying the government needs to do it all, but I think you need to think about these things because that's really what the demand story is telling you.
And local planning regulation is a big part of the problem. So, you know, in the rural areas, it's more difficult than in the cities to get planning approvals. It's just there's so much red tape, and so land's not being opened up for housing development and so on in the rural areas just as much as in the city areas. So. If something could be done to rationalise and, you know, reduce the red tape in local government planning and regulation, I think that would be an enormous freeing up of, you know, the policy space.
And inevitably the question comes, who does what? And that's really what the federation debate in the 21st century has to be. The fact that they're difficult debates to have, and we haven't been very good at them the first 116 years, I'd say shouldn't be the reason to just sort of... Yeah, you need to have it. I mean, I think within the structure of every state government, you've got your hierarchy wrong. Okay, you've got a premier, then you've got a treasurer. What is a treasurer? Your planning minister should be number 2.
Yeah. And I really agree. I mean, that planning piece is crucial. And of course, planning never has been a free market. I mean, we highly regulate who's allowed to do what with land. My suspicion is that if we really liberalise that regime substantially, we would see the population continuing to flow to cities and large cities. The big difference is that we would see a substantially greater proportion of that population going into the middle ring. We'd see a substantial increase in density in our middle rings. And this is one of the really interesting things that's come out of the American literature, we would see obviously much less growth in house prices because what's driving house prices is scarcity of residences as opposed to scarcity of land. And we would also see much less in the growth of inequality. There's some very persuasive US work that essentially shows a lot of the growth in inequality has essentially been in cities that have been growing fast where they have effectively locked up land through planning and zoning so that you make it very difficult to buy an extra house. And what that means is that build an extra house, and the consequence of that is a lot of the benefits of growth get capitalised into house prices, terrific for those who already own them, dreadful for everyone else. So, I mean, I think this is a really interesting thing where we just forget there's never been a free market in this stuff. Planning is far and away the most regulated thing we have. The one thing that you are never allowed to do is just subdivide your block of land because you think that would be a good idea and someone's prepared to pay for it.
But there's a value in the regulation too. I just want to put a warning there because one of the keys is also about livability and how do you maintain and promote livability. So it may not be growing the population, might be retaining the population that you've got around promoting that emphasis on livability. And whilst I agree planning can be an impediment and it's a very hard world to get your head around, one of the reflections I have is one of the challenges about how population growth is being absorbed is getting a proper balance between economic prosperity, the environment and public health, and how those things are kept in balance because increasingly with urban density, you're reclaiming land from past industrial uses or congestion now in terms of higher density living, and our society is not yet adjusting all that easily to what does that mean in terms of noise pollution, what does it mean to the other issues that are being generated through that. And one of the things that really struck me recently in coming to terms with how are we understanding what population growth and urban density, and relaxed in some areas planning provisions mean for how we live with the long-term consequences of that. And there would be many aggrieved citizens who think that proper consideration hasn't been given to that. And certainly in Melbourne most recently, there's been a lot of controversy about the fact that we haven't had what some members of our community think would be an adequate waste management policy. We're going to have one of the biggest landfills in the world, potentially, in inner Melbourne, in Ravenhall, and it's been very controversial about how well are we coping to maintain our credibility around livability by relaxing some of those provisions to ensure that we have population growth and absorb it well. So let's not think about just freeing it up without a regulatory regime that will also balance consideration for the environment and public health.
Look, you clearly touched on an important point there, and it is interesting. I think that the Commonwealth Government now is just refocused on cities, and they're really beefing up their involvement in that issue too. So it is going to be a real sort of touch point for the three levels of government. Okay, other questions, please. I can see a hand up the back there. If we can get a microphone to the gentleman. Just down here, actually, gentleman here with the blue shirt. Oh, there's another one further up the back, is there? Let's go the one down the front first. Let's hear both questions together, and we'll try and answer them as a package, because we're getting a bit tight on time. So I'll start with the gentleman down the front and then the woman towards the back.
Hello, I'm Zach Newlinger from the Department of the Environment and Energy. And my question is, how do you reframe debates so we acknowledge where policies inevitably have people who lose out? Because as I see things, whether it's in, as Penny Armytage was talking about, an increased focus on skills, careers, locking out people who don't have those, or whether it's growth in certain sectors of an economy by definition requiring that other sectors disappear, and those can still be good things, we're often reluctant to acknowledge that that second point occurs, which means that we then don't create policies that address the people disadvantaged by that policy. And it seems to have become almost shameful to acknowledge that there is that secondary impact of a policy. So firstly, would you accept that read on a lot of public discourse? And secondly, how would you see that potentially changing?
Okay, and can we hear from the second questioner, please, as well?
Yeah, very different, but I could almost probably answer that gentleman's question as well, because I think I'm a former secondary school teacher who's taught in a regional school in a disadvantaged northern school. I left after 5 years. I'd fundamentally say the system in those areas is very broken. So it's interesting now I work in the public service, not in the education department. But I would say that everything comes back to, so it was interesting being a teacher, working in a regional school. I'm glad to hear that some data does get used, because the amount of times I was at a school at 8 o'clock at night, filling in more statistics for someone who was doing a policy, when you couldn't afford to buy a set of books for your class, was kind of an irony that it was often discussed. I got out after 5 years. I regret that, frequently, but I am a much saner human for it. I just think unless you have everything that Penny was talking about, that George was talking about, unless you have, if a little kid can't walk in our society, we get 3 people and an occupational therapist to treat them. I've had 16-year-olds in my class who had 6-year-old reading levels, and that's not uncommon. I just wish that policy and policy people, maybe it's having skin in the game or something, maybe George was talking, this is a very long question, but unless you have political masters at some point who have kind of skin in the game, I'm very glad that our Premier sends his kids to a public school. I hope that continues to secondary level. I just think that just about everything you've said comes back to public schools and having an absolutely palatial public school system and putting teachers and rewarding them with what they do. And I'd also, as a postscript, I now work in superannuation. And John, I am astonished that you didn't recommend going up to the 12.5%. And that's all I'll say.
Okay, who would like to respond to
Maybe I'll just go first quickly, because I'll take the first question Second question was great, actually, but especially about the education system. The first question is the idea that there should be no losers has been the operating thought in federal politics, as I've covered it, since the implementation of the GST. So basically, the turn into the 21st century, which takes us into our second decade of 2.5 decades of uninterrupted growth, suddenly we got the idea in our head politically that everybody had to be bought off. And I'm not just talking about the way the GST was implemented, that there'd be no losers, because the rhetoric when Keating did the original Option C and when Hewson did Fight Back, when he released Fight Back in 1991, there were losers, not only implied, but stated in those two documents. There were no losers in the GST package. If you're looking about the cultural shift in the political dialogue, those three documents, Option C in 85, Fight Back in 91, and the new tax system in 1998, and the way it was implemented, the idea of no losers is relatively speaking a recent phenomena, but it's a tricky one. You look at, say, the dairy deregulation, which would have been about 2000, 2001, those who stayed on the farm were also given the structural adjustment package. So you paid the winners as well as the losers. So
Same with Gonski as well.
same with Gonski, exactly the same with Gonski. There'd be no losers. So this is a problem in the political class, and it's the research tells you that the voters don't think this way, but as soon as you find the voter you're going to take the money off, they start to think that way as well. So it's very tricky. First point, it's very tricky to unpack. The second part, and I see we're now down to 27 seconds, sorry, left in the session. I think the big cultural shift the other big cultural shift I've noticed in the last 30 years is the politician who thinks they're the area expert. And if I hear anyone groan, I'm with you, right? Yeah, 70s, 80s and 90s, up to your mid-90s politician looked at the public service as an information source, and they adapted politically the message. They distilled the advice they got politically and put it out to the public. And if they had another idea, they might ask you to shape that other idea, but essentially the bonds of trust between public servant and politician was pretty strong. And this may be a cohort effect when you've got this sort of big macro story of the Australian economy growing every year. But I've covered now on both sides of politics. I don't do daily journalism anymore, but I've seen a number of them, and I'm not going to name them in this room because it wouldn't be fair on the ones I left out, because I want to name them as well, because there's just not enough time to name them all. They come into Parliament thinking they are the area expert, and they are very difficult beasts to corral, I think, in the advice space. So it's those two things. It's the idea that nobody loses, and it's the idea that the person who runs the office knows more than the area expert. Those two ideas, I think, are the things that concern me. And how you break it, I don't know. Short of a recession, you can't break it. So you have to nudge them down a more righteous path.
And I would sort of play to say, I think that first question, and really all of them, how we use the data, because I think sometimes it's hard to ignore the facts. So if we get smarter at presenting the data in the first instance and then interrogating that in terms of what it might mean then for the policy consequences and the advice that we're given, maybe we'll get some of those balancing things better. And so I think that the more that we're seeing governments trying to link data, trying to interrogate the data they already hold and the broader data that's available, we might get a better consideration of some of those downside consequences that might need to be taken into account when we're developing our policy.
By the way, I don't want to have the final word because I'll give somebody else the final word. Have a look at what they're doing in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Everything is hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
They are now a full open government.
Open government.
Full open government. And probably about the only thing you can get Australians fired up about is the fact that the Kiwis are doing stuff better than us now. And we haven't had to think this way for 20 or 30 years. So that is one area I want people to focus on.
If I can just add, I would agree with you that in the long run, the quality of education, school education, particularly in the government sector, is the biggest lever for just about everything that we care about that government can actually influence. That said, I'm not sure that we have always run our government school system as well as we might, and not because of any of the regional issues we've been talking about, or indeed not obviously because there's a lack of overall funding, but because one way or another we haven't managed it as a system as well as we could, and clearly some other countries have managed it much better. And let's be honest, one of the issues is that it has been very difficult to get change to flow through that system in terms of better performance feedback, better performance management, better management of the schools, better management of the areas, all of those kinds of things. The fact that we now actually have at least some education data is starting to help, but we've got a long way to go. And on superannuation, we can talk about that another time.
We're about due to move to morning tea. Any last comments from anyone before we let people go and have some refreshments? All right. Well, then it just left to me to on your behalf, thank this tremendous panel of speakers this morning. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I have. Penny Armytage, John Daley, Marcia Langton, George Megalogenis, thanks very much.